paint the outside of the picture black, what are some mistakes I need to avoid? What are the trip-ups?
Yeah. I think one of the trip-ups is thinking that spicing up the music and sprucing up the building and spiking up the sermon is going to bring about a church transformation. I do think worship is a big part of that. We heard many churches say we concentrated on our worship first. One church I think of, Valley View is the name of the church, they said we spent a year getting our worship right and then we began to reach out. But I think ultimately what we're looking at there is putting a Band-Aid on something that's much bigger than that. And so what I would say is one of the most common mistakes is let's just fix what we see. Because what we see is not often where the real big issues are. We need to see hearts changed. We need to see people refocused on the gospel. We need to see people together saying all hands on deck for the Great Commission. I think that's one. Number two is responding too early to resistance. People will push other directions. People will not agree. And I should say to pastors and church leaders who are watching, disagreeing with you does not necessarily mean you're a bad person or you're out of the will of God. Good. Sometimes we think that, well, they're questioning. No, I mean, they just have a different opinion. That's okay. But you have to remember that if change theorists are right, and there are people who study these things, that 1 out of 5 people are just going to oppose every change, no matter what you say. If the Lord himself spoke audibly in a church service and said, we should make our church service longer, people would say, but we're kind of comfortable with it right now. And so 1 out of 5 people. So what happens is that pastors and church leaders, they respond to the 20% who always resist or oppose change, and that's how they live their ministries. Well, we'd like to do it, but 1 out of 5 people would say no, and so we don't do it. You have to get consensus, but not unanimity. And I think a strong consensus is necessary. But people are afraid to offend the 20%. Here's what I would say to you. The 20%, that's the way they live their life. At work, they're always saying, no, don't do it. And then their manager says, well, we're going to do it anyway. And so they're accustomed to being that lone voice. But in the church, we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Well, here's what I would say. If God is speaking to the church, and we've prayed and we've fasted and we heard from the Lord, the leadership is going that direction. The body feels the call of God to go that direction. We can't stop every time there's some resistance. As a pastor, I tell pastors I work with all the time, if 10% of the church is not mad at you at any given time, you are not trying hard enough. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, secondly, is to not quit early at the first sign of resistance. And thirdly, I would say that you've got to dig in and stay long term. John Knox once said of Scotland, he said, give me Scotland or I die. Yeah, exactly. And so we've got to say the same thing about Naperville. We've got to say the same thing about Springfield. we got to dig in, we got to dig deep in Lincoln and say, give me this community or I die. Because ultimately, if not, if you're a pastor and you come into a church and this is a multi-generational church, why should we, you're the new guy, you're going to be gone in 6 months anyway. You've got to come and say, this is my church. God has planted me here. I have no other designs or plans. Now, I never know what the Spirit might say, but I'm going to stay and we're going to go on this journey together.
So we're moving from career to calling.
We really are. And I think part of the challenge is for pastors, and I know pastors and leaders are watching this, but for pastors, we've bought into the lie that we're in a profession. There's a very well-known book, Brothers, We Are Not Professionals. I think it's important for us to remember that we're not called to a profession. In the New Testament, Paul the Apostle, he moved in and out of vocational ministry. And pastors may say, I'm going to come, I'm going to stay for the long haul, and if the church struggles for a while, I might have to get another job, I might have to go another direction. There's no shame in that because I have a calling, not a career. Good. And there's a distinction between the two.
Okay, one more thing for me, Dr. Setzer.
Yes, put just Ed, just
your hat and
your
yes, smock and your stethoscope on.
All right.
I'm going to give you 3 to 5 minutes with the leaders of Illinois.
Yeah.
What would you want to say that would be most encouraging to them? What is the most hopeful, far-reaching thing that you could say, knowing the landscape of the church, the USA, you've studied the Assemblies of God, we've spent some time talking about Illinois. Yeah. But what is the most far-reaching, powerful, hopeful thing that you think we should have on our front page? Help me get there.
To me, it boils down to some theological principles. God has chosen the church to make known His manifold wisdom in the world. Okay, we know that. He's going to use the church. We also recognize that the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And I reckon right now people are frustrated with the church. We see a lot of young adults frustrated with the church. A lot of people have been in church a long time. People have been people are writing books against the church, saying you got to leave church for your spiritual journey. And, people are beating on the church like a low-hanging piñata on Cinco de Mayo. And I know that right now the church, she's not that attractive. She's supposed to be the bride of Christ, and she doesn't look so good. And I get that. But Jesus has chosen the church. You can't love Jesus and hate his wife. Jesus says the church is the bride of Christ. And so what I would say is I believe that the brightest days of the church are ahead of it if she rediscovers her mission, rediscovers her passion. And I think maybe has gotten distracted. She's gotten distracted by so many other things. She's fallen in love with forms of expression that maybe, I'll often tell evangelical churches if the 1950s came back, most evangelical churches would be ready to go. Maybe she's fallen in love with a past era. She's fallen in love with a strategy. Maybe she read a book and said, if we just do these 5 things, and what I would say is the church has to regain her first love. But Jesus hasn't given up on the church. He won't. He can't. He doesn't have a plan B. This is his decision. Yeah. And so God's going to use churches. I just want God to use your churches. I want God to use my church. I want our churches to say what Isaiah said. Isaiah has this powerful encounter with God in Isaiah 6. King Uzziah has died, and he's caught up in this experience. There's smoke and angels with wings and eyes, and he's encountering the holiness of God, and he pronounces a curse on himself. That's how we respond. He says, woe to me, for I'm a people. I'm a man of unclean lips from a people of unclean lips. And he then, in the midst of all that, he responds the way we should. When we worship God, encounter his holiness, he responds. God speaks, says, who's going to go for us? Who are we going to send? And he says, here I am, Lord, send me. I think when we encounter God in powerful worship, when we understand God in his holiness and his perfection, our response is a missional one. We say, here I am, Lord, send me. When we get to that, see, I'm encouraged because I think churches are getting that. I think churches in Illinois are getting that, and your movement are getting it, other movements are getting it. They're saying, here I am, Lord, send me. I just want more of them to say that because I believe we've got a lot of churches with love Jesus, love his word, moving in the work of God, and yet they're doing so often in amongst themselves. I want them to go and say, here I am, Lord, send me.